This is a story of a divine test, of human cunning meeting divine wisdom, and of a punishment so profound and strange that it has echoed through centuries. It is the story of a community blessed with guidance, who chose instead the path of deception and faced a consequence that serves as an eternal warning. This is the full story of the people of the Sabbath, the community that defied Prophet David and was transformed into apes. To understand this story, we must first travel back in time, to the aftermath of Prophet Moses. The children of Israel had been saved from Pharaoh, they had received the Torah, the divine law, and they had been granted the land of Palestine. They were a chosen people, entrusted with a great responsibility to uphold God's law and be a guiding light to the world. But as time passed, complacency set in. The fervent faith of the Exodus generation gave way to the comfortable negligence of their descendants. They began to forget the covenant. They began to twist the law to suit their desires. They needed reminders, and so, God in His infinite mercy sent them prophets, one after another, to call them back to the straight path. Among the greatest of these prophets were David and his son Solomon. David, known in Arabic as Dawud, was not just a prophet, he was a king. God had granted him immense wisdom, a powerful kingdom, and the Zabur, the Psalms. He could understand the language of the birds and the animals. He was a ruler of justice and piety. His very existence was a living reminder of God's favor upon the children of Israel. Yet, even under the rule of a prophet king, some communities strayed. Our story focuses on one such town, a coastal settlement, likely on the shores of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba. The people of this town were fishermen. The sea was their livelihood, their source of sustenance and trade. For them, God instituted a specific test linked to the Sabbath. The Sabbath, or Sabt, was a sacred institution commanded by God. Since the time of Moses, it was a day of complete rest from worldly labor, a day dedicated solely to the worship and remembrance of God. It was a weekly reset for the soul, a tangible sign of the covenant between God and the children of Israel. For the people of this town, the test manifested in a miraculous, recurring event. Every Friday, as the Sabbath approached, the fish would be scarce, the sea would seem empty. But on the Sabbath itself, the fish would come in massive, teeming schools, swimming openly and brazenly near the shore, more plentiful than on any other day. It was as if the sea itself was presenting them with a choice. On the 6 regular days, they had to work hard for their catch, but on the 7th, the day they were commanded to rest, their entire year's catch seemed to present itself effortlessly. This was the test. Would they obey God's command and leave the abundant fish alone, demonstrating their trust that God's provision on the other 6 days was sufficient? Or would their eyes glaze over with greed? Would their hearts be conquered by the desire for immediate, easy gain, leading them to break the covenant for a handful of fish? For a time, the people resisted, but the temptation was relentless, happening every single week. The sight of the shimmering, jumping fish, the thought of the wealth they were losing, began to eat away at their resolve. A schism formed within the community. A group among them, whose hearts were still filled with piety and fear of God, stood firm. They reminded the others of the covenant. They warned them of the consequences of disobedience. They were the admonishers, the voices of conscience in the town. The other group, larger and louder, felt the pull of worldly desire more strongly. They began to grumble. Why should we let this bounty go to waste? They argued. We are not directly catching them on the Sabbath. We are just facilitating a catch. This is where human cunning entered the scene. They sought not to obey, but to negotiate with God's law. They wanted the benefit of sin without the technical label of sin. They devised a plan, a loophole they believed was brilliant. The day before the Sabbath, on Friday, they would go to the shore and dig trenches, channels, and pools connected to the sea. They would construct elaborate weirs and dams with gates. This work was done on a weekday, which was technically permissible. Then, on the Sabbath itself, when the massive schools of fish swam into these channels and pools, they would simply close the gates, trapping the fish inside. In their minds, they were not catching or working on the Sabbath. The fish were just there, trapped by a mechanism they had built the day before. After the sun set and the Sabbath ended on Saturday evening, they would then open the gates and collect their immense trapped bounty. They congratulated themselves on their cleverness. They thought they had outsmarted the command. They believed they could have their cake and eat it too, to enjoy the worldly benefit of breaking the law while pretending to keep its letter. The righteous group saw this for what it was: blatant hypocrisy and a mockery of God's commandment. They confronted the transgressors. Arguments broke out in the town. The admonishers pleaded, "Why do you do this? Do you not fear Allah? This is a clear disobedience." The transgressors mocked them. "We are not doing anything wrong. We are not fishing on the Sabbath. We are just collecting what is already caught." The righteous ones replied, "Why do you preach to a people whom Allah is about to destroy or to punish with a severe punishment?" They felt their warnings were falling on deaf ears. The admonishers answered, "To be absolved before your Lord, and perhaps they may fear him." They were fulfilling their duty. They were making their stance clear. They would not be complicit through their silence. The situation escalated. The town became divided into two clear camps: the disobedient transgressors, who continued their deceptive practice, growing wealthier and more arrogant, and the righteous minority, who watched in despair, continuing to warn them to know of. News of this rebellion, this open mockery of the Sabbath, reached Prophet David. As the prophet and king, this was a matter of grave concern. Here was a community under his guidance, directly challenging a fundamental commandment of God with a cheap trick. He was grieved and angered by their arrogance. He prayed to God for guidance. He asked God to judge these people and to deal with them according to his wisdom. God answered the prayer of his prophet, Dawud. It was swift, decisive, and designed to be a lesson for all of humanity until the end of time. On the fateful day, the transgressors were at their pools. As usual, they had closed the gates, watching with glee as the enormous haul of fish flapped helplessly in the trapped water. They were boasting, laughing, and counting their future profits, utterly heedless of the warnings that had been issued for weeks and months. Then, the command of God came. It did not come with a thunderous explosion or an earthquake, though its impact was more terrifying than any natural disaster. It was a transformative command, a command that altered the very essence of their being. God declared that because they had behaved like animals, allowing their base, greedy, cunning instincts to override the divine spirit and reason granted to them, they would be made to look like the animals they had chosen to emulate. In an instant, their human forms were stripped away, their bodies contorted and shifted, their skin grew coarse hair, their postures hunched over, their speech turned into guttural screeches and grunts. Where once stood arrogant, clever men and women, now stood confused, frightened apes. The transformation was total and complete. They were not killed, they were changed. Their human consciousness, their souls, were likely trapped within these bestial forms, a living hell of awareness and humiliation, unable to communicate, only to mimic and screech, a perpetual state of regret and shame. Imagine the scene. The righteous group, watching from a distance, saw this miracle of punishment unfold before their eyes. The laughter and boasting they heard moments before were replaced by the panicked chattering of apes. The sight must have been utterly terrifying, a direct and undeniable manifestation of God's absolute power and his wrath against those who mock his signs. The Quran describes this event in several chapters, emphasizing its importance as a lesson. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 65, "And you certainly knew of those who transgressed among you concerning the Sabbath, and we said to them, Be apes, despised and despised." In Surah Al-Araf, verses 63 to 66. The story is told in more detail, highlighting the test the defiance and the command to the righteous, to not grieve over the fate of the disobedient, for God's command is always just. The punishment did not end with that generation. The Quran tells us that God made this event a punishment for those who were present at that time, and an example for those who would follow after, and an admonition for those who fear Allah. The story of the transformation into apes is not an isolated incident in the Quran. It is mentioned alongside other severe punishments for communities that rejected their prophets, like the flood of Noah, the tempest of Hud, and the lightning strikes for the people of Shoaib. It sits within a clear theological framework that defying God's clear commands after receiving guidance leads to severe consequences. But why apes? The choice of animal is deeply symbolic. Apes mimic human. They have a form that resembles mankind, but is devoid of reason, spirit, and moral responsibility. The transgressors, in their attempt to mimic obedience while harboring disobedience, in their cunning mimicry of the law, were reduced to the state of mimic. They lost the very thing that made them human, the ability to choose righteousness through genuine faith and submission. They became a physical manifestation of their inner spiritual state. The lessons from this story are vast and timeless, relevant to every generation including ours. First, it is a lesson about the danger of hypocrisy and legal loopholes. God's commandments are to be followed in spirit and in truth. Trying to technically adhere to the letter of the law while completely violating its spirit is not cleverness. It is a grave sin that angers God more than open disobedience sometimes, because it adds deception to defiance. It is the ultimate arrogance to think one can outsmart the Creator. Second, it is a lesson about the danger of sinning openly and collectively. When a whole community normalizes a sin, it becomes easier to commit. The transgressors encouraged each other, normalizing their deceptive practice. Sin loves company, but that company leads to collective punishment. Third, it is a testament to the importance of enjoining good and forbidding evil. The righteous group was saved, specifically because they spoke out. Their duty was not to force the others to stop, but to clearly distance themselves from the sin and advise against it. Their salvation was tied to their vocal stance against wrongdoing. Fourth, it demonstrates that God's tests are often tailored to our specific weaknesses. For a fishing community, the test was fish. For another community, it might be wealth, power, or status. We must identify what our Sabbath fish are, the temptations that lure us into compromising our principles. Fifth, and most importantly, it is a stark reminder of the power and authority of God. He is the one who gives form, and He is the one who can change it in an instant. His knowledge encompasses all our schemes and loopholes. Nothing is hidden from Him. The story does not end with the apes. Islamic tradition holds that these transformed beings did not live long. They did not procreate. They were a sign, not a new species. They were ostracized, feared, and they eventually perished, their end serving as the final chapter of their punishment. For us, the audience millennia later, the story remains. It is not a fairy tale or a myth. For believers, it is a historical event, a real account from which we must derive meaning. It calls us to examine our own lives. Are we, in our own ways, digging trenches on a Friday to catch forbidden fish on a Saturday? Are we finding clever justifications for our disobedience? Are we mocking the commandments of God through our actions while paying lip service to them? The story of the people turned into apes is a chilling narrative, but it is also a mercy. It is a warning shot across the bow of humanity, a clear signpost that says, this path leads to ruin, turn back. It is a call to sincere, heartfelt submission, to obedience that comes from love and fear of God, not from a desire to gain the system. It reminds us that true intelligence is not in cunning deception, but in humble submission to the one who created us, who knows what is best for us, and whose law is designed for our own benefit in this life and the next. Let the story be a lesson. Let the image of those transformed beings be a reminder. Let us strive to be among those who enjoin good and forbid evil, who stand firm during tests, and who obey God with sincerity, not with loopholes. For the command of God is absolute, and His wisdom is final.